Hey patchwork friends, it's Emily. I am an almost lifelong quilter with a lot of stories to tell. I have loved quilts and talking about them for as long as I can remember, and I'm here to celebrate the tradition of quilting with you. From family heirlooms to thrift store finds, every quilt holds a piece of history and a little piece of a quilter's heart. Join me every other week to get back to your quilting roots. We'll celebrate quilts and the real people who made them, learn a little bit about the history of quilting, and have lots of fun exploring ways to reclaim tradition in a modern world. I'm so glad you're joining me here this week at Patchwork Revival. All right, friends, it is episode 6, and we are talking all about documenting our quilts. So this is one of those episodes that I have been so excited to start researching and gathering ideas, and now that I'm finally here sharing them with you, I want to be sure that we each approach this topic from the intentive perspective. First off, as your self-appointed podcast host, I am a quilt maker, a quilt collector, a quilt appreciator, and lover of all things quilting. But I decided to start this podcast to share that love of quilting with listeners. I do know a bit about quilting because I've been doing it for over 25 years now, but I am not a professional. I am not a quilt historian, a quilt appraiser, a quilt show judge. You get the point. I know what works for me. I know what I like, and I have a fair amount of experience. You should note that most of figuring out what I like has come from many experiences of trying and either failing or flying. So if I've tried it and I'm telling you about it, it's probably pretty legit. But please know that any tips or advice or ideas that I share are not meant to be paternalistic, and they certainly do not describe any sort of standard that is expected to be met by each and every quilter everywhere. My true hope is that you as a listener will find inspiration, that any ideas or techniques that I talk about will evoke your imagination and just simply open up the door to possibility in your quilting practice. So now that we've gotten through that little disclaimer, let's jump into this discussion that's all about labeling and documenting our quilts. So, the basics. To document is defined in a dictionary as to record something in written, photographic, or other form. A document is defined as a piece of written, printed, or electronic material that provides information or evidence that serves as an official record. So just sitting here and thinking about the roots of that word, document, as both a noun and a verb, it begins to highlight the importance of taking the time to record in one way or another this tangible legacy that you are leaving behind by making a quilt. Whether you know it or not, that quilt you are making right now, just like the one you made a decade ago or the one you're going to make in 5 years, is a tangible representation of your quilting practice that is absolutely going to be transmitted to future generations of quilters. So let's imagine a scenario for a moment. You have a favorite aunt or a mother-in-law or a best friend's mother, something of that sort, and for whatever reason, you are helping pack up some of the belongings in their home. You open up a closet in the back spare bedroom of the house, and up at the very back corner of a tip-top shelf, there is a beautiful queen size double wedding ring quilt that is clearly hand-pieced, hand-quilted, and has been lovingly, painstakingly stored up in this closet. You pull it down, you ask someone else who is there if they know anything about this quilt because you are just in awe of this piece of art. And they say, I don't really know. I know that she quilted, but so did her friends, or so did her sister. So now you're left here holding this beautiful quilt, and you're completely unaware of how significant this quilt should be to someone. Who should take this heirloom, and how can its significance be explained? Whose fabrics were these made with? What was life like for the maker of this quilt? Why was this quilt tucked in a back closet? Did your mother-in-law make it and then just hate it, so she shoved it back there? Or did she make it and love it so much that she never wanted to use it? Did she make it and then have it saved for a special occasion that has yet to happen? Or was it a precious heirloom that her grandmother had made? So, y'all, this is so stressful, or at least to me, it is stressful. And it's sad because imagine how long it would take someone to hand piece a queen size quilt top, then hand quilt it and finish it, and then just leave it sitting around with nobody to claim it and nobody to tell its story. All of these situations are situations that I can almost guarantee have happened to you or will happen to you one of these days. In fact, my friend Brie and I discussed this just a bit in episode 3, where we talk about finding old quilts or quilt tops in thrift stores. This has happened to us both. And actually, this is our pretty common and predominant experience with finding these quilts. They're just completely anonymous, totally unlabeled. So now, jump back in that scenario with me. You look up in the back of the closet, you pull down this incredible work of art, you open it up to admire it, and lo and behold, there is a label affixed to the bottom corner of the quilt. It says that this quilt was made by Mama Newman for her grandmother's upcoming wedding. And so you are able to turn to your friend and tell them exactly what that label said, that Mama Newman had left specific instructions on who should be the owner of this quilt. And that is exactly what you make happen. So as much as this sounds like a silly or kind of made up story, this happens all the time. And it even happens quite regularly in my family. So I have discussed my mama. That was a hypothetical story, by the way, but I use the word mama because that's what I called my grandmother. So I discussed my mama's prolific quilting legacy in episode 1 entitled Coralie. And we have quilts from her that we have accumulated over different life events and things like that. Now, my dad grew up spending tons of time with a woman named Aunt Lottie. And when he tells me stories about her, I can tell that he remembers her in a way similar to how I remember my grandparents. So he remembers that Aunt Lottie and my mama made quilts, they swapped fabrics, that sort of thing. And after Aunt Lottie died, he said he made sure that he got a specific quilt that she had made because it had scraps from some of his older clothing and things like that. But here's the kicker. In my mom and dad's house currently, there are many old quilts, and we know for sure that they were made either by my mama or by Aunt Lottie. But it is always in doubt as to which is which. Always. In some ways, it isn't that big of a deal because my dad knows that the quilt Aunt Lottie made is there somewhere. But to me, it's a huge deal because I didn't know Aunt Lottie, but I've heard so many stories about her. And I would love to know with 100% certainty which quilt was hers. To me, this will feel particularly important whenever I become part of the process of deciding which quilts should go where someday and that sort of thing. So just taking all of these tidbits of experience that I've had and this sort of blended scenario of things that I've discussed with friends and experienced myself as well, will hopefully make us all appreciate the reason why we need to label our quilts. Label the quilts, people. At the end of the day, it's not for us. We know our work, we know our quilts, but our children don't. Our spouses don't. Our nieces and nephews may not. You get the point. So hopefully we're all convinced of the importance of labeling our quilts. And here are a few ideas of how you can go about doing so. Now, I personally have 2 ways of labeling a quilt. The first is with a fancy hand-embroidered label. This is for special quilts. For quilts that I really want to spend the time making special and unique, I typically will do a hand embroidered label for a cover quilt of one of my quilt patterns that I've written or designed, or maybe a special quilt that I'm going to gift to someone, but I don't necessarily intend to include tons of information. The thing about hand embroidering is it takes a fair amount of time, and I feel like you really can only put so much information on one label that you're going to hand embroider. I'll generally print a pretty simple label with the pattern name, my name, and the date, generally the month and the year. And then I'll transfer it I print that on paper, and then I'll transfer it to the fabric using carbon paper, and then I'll embroider. Another technique that I use for labeling is one that is much quicker, makes it a lot easier to include a lot of information, and that is by printing a label on my inkjet printer. So fun fact, for years now, I have been making my own printer-capable fabric by ironing fabric onto a pre-cut letter-sized piece of freezer paper. That way it will have some stiffness to be able to pass through the printer. But there are times when this has gotten a little bit dicey. I definitely have had to clean my printer's print heads more frequently. I've had some ink smudging. I've had some jams of fabric in the printer. My husband, if he's listening, is realizing in this moment that we really don't have a piece of junk printer. It's just that I've been running fabric through it. Now, I have learned through my crowdsourcing of information for this episode that there is an easier way. So one of my local quilt club members informed me that there are sheets of color-fast printable fabric. So a quick search online will show you that they're available at big box stores, including like Walmart, Joann's, those sorts of things. And I'm about to go buy a ton to keep on hand. I'll include a link in the show notes to the ones that I'm going to purchase, and I can't wait to share how they work out. I did reach out on social media and to my quilt club for some other ideas just to sort of crowdsource things as far as multiple sort of ideas and inspirations for making quilt labels. And so some other ideas I got for actually how to label quilts from other listeners include machine embroidering. So this can be an after-made label, meaning one that is made separately and then affixed to the quilt at a later time. Obviously, that means you need to have a machine that can competently embroider. But I have a machine, and part of the decorative stitches that it offers are letters. So I can do lettering on my machine, even though it is technically not a embroider-specific embroidery machine. Somebody else mentioned that she even embroiders with her machine on a piece of the patchwork prior to sewing it into the quilt. And I think that is such a neat idea that is so unique. And it's kind of an interesting way to imagine you could hide little tidbits or nuggets into the quilt. Some people will just use a fabric safe marker, something with like an archival ink that's color fast. They'll simply write a label on fabric, heat set it with their iron. I say this is an awesome idea. Just do whatever is easy and whatever works. Honestly, I can imagine if I had a label that had been handwritten by my grandmother, I would just be so enamored with that. We don't often think of our handwriting as being special always, but it truly can be considered that way by others, by people who love you. So that's something to think about there. Another listener mentioned that they will also print labels on fabric and then sew that label actually into the backing of the quilt. I think this is a great idea because it addresses both the idea of creating the label and then the idea of how to actually affix the label to the quilt. So when I affix a label to a quilt, I do one of a few things, just kind of depending on the mood I'm in, I guess, or kind of where the project is taking me. So a hand embroidered label for me tends to be a little bit bigger than a printed label. So what I'll generally do is fold it into a triangle, and then I'll sew that into the bottom corner of the quilt by sewing two sides into the binding. And then I'll hand stitch the last edge, the kind of triangle hypotenuse down with a hand stitch to secure it. The triangle label is a popular choice. I think because it's relatively easy to have it be a no-show label, that meaning it's visible only from the back. And that's because you basically stitch the two legs of the triangle into the quilt binding. So I got a few responses from listeners stating that this was also their preferred way to affix a label in general. If your sewing machine is skipping a stitch or just needs a little TLC, we've got just the fix for you. Check out our friends at Creative Stitches, where any machine in the greater San Angelo area, regardless of make or model, gets the care it needs to keep running smoothly. They'll even offer convenient pickup and drop-off services. Give them a call at 325-895-8523. That's 325-895-8523. Keep your stitches neat and your creativity flowing with Creative Stitches. Now, another way that I attach labels, and honestly, this is probably how I do most of them, is basically by making a patch. So I'll stitch or I'll print a label and then I'll leave about a 1/2 inch of seam allowance on all of the sides. And I'll just iron that to the back of the label so that it'll create a finished edge on all 4 corners or all 4 edges. From there, I will either hand stitch the label on using like an invisible stitch, similar to how I hand stitch my binding, or I'll use like a number 8 pearl cotton thread to make a decorative running stitch, or like a similar to like big stitch binding, if you've ever heard of that. And it's really not that noticeable, but it gives a nice little decorative touch. Now, none of these are going to be noticeable from the front of the quilt, and they're going to make sure that your label is securely on. I have also been known to just slap that kind of label on the back bottom corner of the quilt and secure it with just a regular old straight running stitch or a zigzag stitch on my machine, and I'll just choose a coordinating thread. You absolutely can see this from the front of the quilt, but I generally make it a point to put it in a kind of nondescript area that's really not noticeable unless you're specifically looking for it. I think that the straight stitch is a little bit less noticeable than the zigzag stitch, but either way, it looks fine. And I think that it's just a kind of better way to make sure you have at least something labeled on your quilt than just nothing at all. I can imagine that this could also work if you used a sort of iron-on adhesive and then mimicked like a raw edge applique type technique, but that is not something I've tried before. I'm not a raw edge applique expert. That's just kind of something that I've imagined in the past I might try for quilt labels. But yes, I have not actually tried that yet. So what should we actually put on our label? I have a preference for what I like to put. We've sort of talked, if I'm hand embroidering, it's a little bit more sparse. But if I'm really intentionally labeling a project, I am going to put names. I'm going to put dates. Usually it is the month and the year, because I don't like whip out the quilt over a course of a week. I have some quilts that I've been working on for years, or that I have worked on for years. And in those cases, I put the approximate month and year that it was started, and then the approximate month and year that it was actually finished. And then I also put my location, so my city and then my state of residence where I lived when I was making the quilt. If it's a gift, I will include the name of the person that the quilt was made for. Usually I will say something like lovingly made for baby XYZ by Emily Dodd of Dreamland Quilting, for example. And then if there is an occasion, wedding, first birthday, my, baby's first big kid bed, that sort of thing, I'll include that on the label as well. If the design is not mine, I will include the pattern name and the design studio. Sometimes I'll include a little poem or some song lyrics of something of the sort. I did make one of my children for their big kid bed that they got, and I put some of the lyrics to the song that I sang to him every night as I was putting him down to bed. So he'll have that on there forever. One of the ladies from my quilt club had similar ideas to me, that basically more is more when it comes to quilt labeling. So she told me that she will include a special name that she comes up with for each of her quilts that reflects her fabric choices and the design. For her personally, that is important. And I think that's really neat because I think it acknowledges her work as a piece of art. Artists title their paintings and things of that sort. So it seems totally reasonable to title your quilt if you feel so called to do so. She said that she thinks it's also important to include her town, state of residence, the year, the names of the recipient, her name, the quilter's name, and then the pattern designer. And then she'll also do a little quote, meaningful phrase, a poem, or something of that sort, if it's a special gift. I thought this was interesting because I am a self-finisher. I quilt my quilts. But I absolutely love that she mentions the idea of including the name of the quilter of the quilt, especially with the prevalence of long arm quilting utilization. This is important because long arming and quilting itself is really an art form that we can absolutely appreciate and honor with our work. And really, if you didn't put that, someone in the next generation who maybe didn't really understand how quilting works or sort of the common ways that we finish quilts might just assume that you did that, and you didn't. I did also ask listeners on social media to give me some ideas on what they would want on a label of a quilt that they received. And basically, we got the 5 W's. So who, what, when, where, why. And I think that's a great framework for creating a quilt label, just like it was a great framework for crafting an essay back in 3rd grade. It gets to the point. It makes things a little bit simple. And I think having a framework kind of takes the guesswork out of it. So just plug and play, get your quilt labeled, and get that baby on your quilt. Another inclusion that I've seen on a quilt label, particularly for one that is to be gifted, is including care instructions. Now, that could get a bit dicey because there are likely differing schools of thought here, and care instructions might change depending on how old the quilt is at the time that it may need washing and drying. But the flip side of that coin is that what I feel is by including care instructions, you are indirectly inviting the recipient of the quilt to use the quilt, which is absolutely the whole point of me making a quilt in the first place. Other thoughts on the label. Those little cute woven labels are so cool and so cute, but really I wish they had more information on them. I actually am planning to incorporate some with my name and my state into my quilts. I have plans to order them. I just haven't done so, but I'm also going to include other more extensive labels because I just really do think that we need to give our quilts their rightful place in history, and we are the ones who can accurately do so. So do it. I feel strongly about this, and so I am going to include a link for a template for a quilt label that you will be able to customize for yourself in your own projects for free. Now, you will have to input your email address so that I can send it to you, but it is yours to use and keep and use again. And don't forget that there are such things as inkjet printer optimized fabric sheets. So get you some to have on hand and get those quilts labeled, my friends. One other sentiment mentioned in my Quilt Club's labeling conversation was that pre-making labels can be so helpful in an event where someone may come and find unfinished or partially finished projects in your studio when someday you aren't there or able to inform people of your plans. Or maybe you just can't really remember your own plan for your work in progress. So I found that very interesting, and I have talked to people in the past who inherited their entire sewing studio of their grandmother. I know I did, and they found it very difficult to figure out which quilt they would finish and who that quilt would go to and what to say about it. So let's help people out. Let's just list it ourselves. Even writing on a piece of paper and affixing it to a project just to remind yourself and somebody who may be coming later of what the heck is going on, I think is such a cool idea. So I am going to pledge right here, right now to you, my friends, that moving forward, I am going to plan to begin crafting my label as I cut my projects out. even if it's just having it in a computer document that is ready to be printed, that is going to make it so much easier to just make myself get it done. So this is kind of, for me, piggybacking on the reason that I make my binding during piecing my quilt top, because it just always seems so ominous to do it at the end when everything else is complete. But listen, labels are so important. And even though it may feel unnecessary and just like an extra little cherry on top, it is not. It is part of your project. Now, please don't be intimidated by this next thought. Stay with me, folks. I want to share one of my absolute favorite pieces of my quilting legacy that I am absolutely going to pass down for generations. I am holding in my hands my mama's quilt journal. So this is a mass-produced, probably 5x7-ish sized journal that my mama recorded several of her quilts in. So there are printed photos of quilts. I'll share pictures of this in the show notes. And then there are handwritten details on the year that the quilt was made, who the quilt was made for. And honestly, that's about it. There's plenty of room for her to have included more information, but that's really all we've got. She did not label all her quilts. She did not include all of her quilts in this journal, but after she passed away and I started looking at this, I realized just how many quilts she had made over the years that I had never even seen before because they were gifted to someone. But here they are, all in one place for me to enjoy, to appreciate, to be amazed by, and y'all, this is so special. Frankly, it has inspired me to take the extra step of beginning a quilt journal, in addition to labeling all of my quilts with the details that we discussed earlier. So the way I feel when I look at this journal is just incredible. I feel like I am part of my mama's quilting story, and I feel like I'm carrying her story with me just by having this book here. And it's so cool. I feel giddy imagining getting to share this with a fellow quilt lover, especially if that person happens to be one of my children or grandchildren, so much so that I want to create my own quilt journal to document my work. So I'm going to create a template for a printable quilt documentation page similar to these journal pages. And yep, you guessed it, I'm going to share that template with you too. So I'm envisioning for myself printing it out on like a nice cardstock and maybe like eventually having those sheets bound in some way or including it in kind of a scrapbook style or photo style book that has those plastic page protector page holders. That's all to be determined, but you can head on down to the show notes. I'll include the quilt journal template as well as the quilt label template in the show notes. You're going to want to grab it and just make labeling your quilts an enjoyable, easy part of your quilting practice. So this is all I know about quilt labeling, about documenting quilts, friends. If you have any ideas or thoughts, I would love hearing them. The best way to reach out would be to send me a direct message on Instagram on the podcast account at Patchwork Revival Podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and I can't wait to chat with you again soon. Well, friends, that's it for this episode of Patchwork Revival. I loved having you here with me talking all things quilting. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and leave a rave review. Jump on down to the show notes to find any links for this episode, as well as a link to my shop where you can enjoy 15% off as a podcast listener with code REVIVAL. That's REVIVAL. From family heirlooms to thrift store finds, the Patchwork Revival podcast is here to celebrate the generational connection made in the quilts we love. We'll see you next time.